Welcome to the MeshDraw instructions. This is going to be a deep dive in exactly everything you need to know to use MeshDraw. This is going to be kind of rough. I don't have time to edit this and go into all the sound mixing and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be kind of, it is what it is. There's a written documentation that I'm going to try to cover most of the stuff here, so you can see there's a lot to cover. I don't expect anyone to actually read this whole thing or to watch this whole video, so I will put in chapter markers corresponding. So hopefully if you get stuck, you can look it up, you can find the section that applies to your problem, and you can go from there. So yeah, let's dive straight into it. The first thing I want to talk about is the brush requirements. So I've set up a very basic scene here that already has a mesh draw in it, and I have a collection that has just this one single model. And so that's actually the first requirement, is that the mesh draw only works on collections, not individual models. So even if you only have one model that you want to use, it's got to be inside of a collection. So that's the first requirement. Let me just go ahead and add it in. The very top choice of the MeshDraw properties is to choose the collection. And you can see that it automatically puts it on that one curve that was already in there. But the other most important thing here is that it has to range between 0 to 1, or the model has to range between 0 to 1 on the y-axis, on the negative y-axis. So you can see that here. I'm aligned to negative y. I'm somewhat centered on negative y. And it's fitting between 0 and 1. And actually, it's not even that. There's a little bit of a gap on either side. You can see I'm not quite hitting 0 or 1. There's some, I don't know, floating point weirdness that goes on with the thing. And you can get some stretching. And that's one of the first problems you're likely to encounter, is some weird stretching that you may not even see it if you only have one curve, but as soon as you start adding more than one curve, it will become apparent. And so let me, I guess, point out where I show you that this is like a live thing. So if I move this around or rotate it, it's updating live. And so let me draw out a couple more strokes on this. And if you don't know how to do that, this is it's a geometry nodes network, but it's based on a Bezier curve. So if you just select it and hit 1 on the key, well, I use the industry standard shortcuts. I don't know if it's the same, but you go into edit mode, and it's these two tools right here, draw, curve pen, and I would say 90% of the time I'm using draw. And yeah, so I can just draw out a couple more of these. And getting back to that thing I was talking about with the whole 0 to 1 business, watch what happens if I am not 0 to 1. You can see how it's getting confused, and it's trying to stretch the wrong instance onto the wrong subspline, and you get something that looks like that. It's a very easy mistake to make, so be on the lookout for that. So those are really the only two requirements, is that it has to be in a collection and it has to be in the 0 to 1 range. Now, beyond that, there's a few more things that are good to consider. Number one, you want to make sure you have dense enough geometry for how much you want to bend. And that's just going to be personal preferences for what you're trying to do with it. Let's show you some examples. I mean, if I put a really extreme bend on this, it's not going to look good, right? That's pretty obvious, but keep that in mind. I mean, also the way it's going to bend too. If it only needs to bend in one direction but not the other, you might be able to get away with using less polygons in one direction than the other. And what else? I recommend applying transformations. You don't technically have to, but it's just a good idea to do that. Avoid having, like bizarre, it's actually kind of cool, but bizarre non-uniform scales. And if you want it to be textured and have UV mapping, then there's your UV map actually needs to be named UV map, the default blender, because I'm copying that attribute. I have an entire section on UV mapping, texturing, and the shading. There's some workarounds that we have to deal with. I'm not going to get into that right now, but those are the basic brush requirements to use. I keep calling it a brush. I mean, it's just a model. I don't know why. I've been thinking of it in terms of like brushes, and so I apologize if I keep referring to models as brushes, but I do. Okay, that's brush requirements. Let's run through the user controls. I've added, so I now have, the collection I'm using now has 2 models in it, so I can, starting here, we can do random pick. And that's pretty self-explanatory. It's just going to pick for each subspline which model to use. And there's the random seed, so you can mess with that. Spline points. You probably won't need to mess with this. I kind of experimented with it quite a bit. This number 64 that I have it at works pretty good in most cases. You may, if you do have something that's kind of bent really badly, you may try adjusting it either up or down. You will see it change a little bit. And there's also a reason why you might use it if you might want to actually go lower on it if you were trying to go for like a angular type of look, but I would say for most things, keeping it at 64, it's going to work pretty good. Scale overall, that's also pretty explanatory. It's just scaling them. Doesn't make them longer, it just makes it fatter, I guess, right? Scale by length is a very important one. That is on by default, and that one, again, it's kind of self-explanatory. Short ones are going to get scaled down smaller. Big, long ones are going to get scaled out fatter. And so what that does is it keeps the proportions roughly of the original model. But depending on what you're doing, you might not want that. So, yeah, because they might get too, if you need to make something, it could get too fat or something. Especially if you're using tiled repeating brushes, which we'll get into later, it can work against you. So without scale by length, the scale will be whatever the original brush was, or the original model was down here. Overall twist, that's going to twist everything same amount. And twist min and max. That's pretty, also pretty self-explanatory. Each stroke gets a random amount of twist, which is great for like if you're doing like I don't know, like tree branches or grass or something like that, where you don't care which side of it you're looking at. In fact, you get better variation by kind of randomly spinning them. The rest of the controls here are related to this up vector, or this UpHint thing. This is going to be a separate section. So for now, I'll leave it. But yeah, for now, I'm just going to leave that, and we'll move on to the next section. UV considerations. So unfortunately, as of the time that I made this thing, which was Blender 3.2, there's I don't know if it's bugs or if it's just set up weird, or something still needs to be implemented, but there is issues regarding UVs and geometry nodes. And specifically, if I take a look at the network that's making this thing, down here is where I'm instancing the geometry, and before I can warp the vertices around, I have to realize instances. As soon as you do that, it kills your UV information. Kind of a bummer. To work around that, I can actually copy into a new named attribute, which I'm calling MDUVs, and copy the data from UVMap. And it's weird to me that this works with the same data, but it doesn't actually work if you just leave everything default. Like obviously it can be done, but it just doesn't work normally. So, and also I should mention too, this MeshDraw is based off of a curve, so it would have a mesh anyway. But I've built this thing multiple times, and I've done it the other way. The UVs get screwed up starting with a mesh as well. So it's an unfortunate workaround that I have to do. Actually, let me see if I turn that off. Can we see what actually happens? This should. Yeah, well, that wasn't what I was expecting, but you can see that that is important. That transferring the attribute. So what that means is you got to do some junk to make this work. If I look at the model, the UV map is named UV map. That's default Blender, very important. And that's how I'm able to transfer it. How I'm able to view it right now, because right now, I mean, MeshDraw doesn't even have UVs officially. It's just a modifier that's generating geometry. So what I've done is in the shader, I'm pulling in that attribute right there. Now I'm doing something kind of tricky here, and it's okay if you don't fully understand this or whatever, but I'm also taking in the regular UV coordinate, and I'm adding the two together. The reason I'm doing that is because if it can't find one or the other of those, it's going to be 0, and then it'll add together. So if only one of them is present, then it'll be used, and if the other one's present, then it'll be used. The only problem occurs there is if they're both present, but that won't come up until a little bit later when I talk about how to convert this to a regular mesh. So this is the UV setup I've been working with, and it works pretty good. Obviously, if you don't care about the UVs for whatever you're doing, then disregard all of this stuff. But I do think that having the ability to have fully textured, warpable, um, full color RGB models is one of the greatest strengths of this tool. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. And we will come back to this a little later when I talk about converting back to a standard mesh, because we have to do another step to get back to the standard UVs. This video, I'm going to talk about this UpHint use up object. This is kind of confusing, I guess you could say. It's not very intuitive. It's not too bad though. So hopefully I can demystify this and get you up to speed with it. To demonstrate this, I have this object here. Has a direction, left side or right side, and a bottom. Top is blue, the bottom is yellow. And I'm going to show you the effect that this UpHint has on this. Essentially, without going too technical into what's going on, basically the geometry nodes, it's trying to rotate the mesh to match onto the curve. And it needs some user input to kind of give it a hint, to tell it sort of which direction to go. It doesn't have to be a perfect thing, but it needs something. And the problem is the rule of thumb is that you want so right now my UpHint is it's a vector that's pointing straight up on the y-axis. And so basically what I'm saying is that's what I want the top of my mesh to be, basically. And so it looks pretty good while these things are somewhat aligned to the top of them being aligned with that. The problem occurs when we start to go, not too bad. When we start to go in the same direction as that UpHint. You can see it does work. It is actually pretty robust, and you can get away with quite a bit. But if I get too close, that's what happens. And you can see that. You can try to correct for that by like adding twist or something, but yeah, it's still not going to work. So it does mean that you're somewhat limited. You can't just have these things going in every direction. But usually you know what you're doing. If something's predominantly going one way or the other, you can try to choose an UpHint that works. I should point that out. So here we have this twist going in that direction. But if I change this, all of a sudden that goes away. You can kind of see too that adjusting this vector value sort of rotates them a bit. But let me show you this example. So where this really comes into play is, say I want to draw these things along the surface of the sphere. So you might be, if you're doing some clothing or armor or straps or something like that on a character. Well, in that case, you can't just pick one up vector because it keeps changing depending where you're at. So to demonstrate that, let me just put this back to what it was in the default. And so you can see I've set this is the draw tool, curve draw tool, and I've set it to surface mode, which means that the points are going to be kind of on that surface. And you can see it works pretty good up here on the top. If we start to get down towards the side here, you might notice it's no longer, conforming to the surface the way you'd want it to be. And again, if we try to come up the side, then we got a problem. And sure, I could come in here and tweak my up vector here and maybe fix it there, but then it's probably going to cause an issue somewhere else. So in this situation, a single up vector is just not going to cut it. UpHint, I guess I need UpHint. So that's where we can use an object for the up vector. And this object is named sphere, and I pick that down here, and then this Boolean just says use object for up. And immediately, as soon as I turn that on, you can see what happened. It's now transferring the surface normals from the surface, using that to define what the up vector should be. And when you do that, then all of a sudden I can come in here, I can draw these all around here, all the way around the bottom, and in any direction that I want to, and it basically works. Now I would recommend for this up object, or up object, try to keep it simple if you can. If it had a bunch of jagged edges and stuff, that's going to cause weird stuff to go on. Probably also, remove the transforms, that sort of thing. Like if you have some crazy non-uniform stuff going on. But that's the idea. The short, simple thing is if you're trying to draw on a complex surface, then instead of using the UpHint, go for an up object, and it should be good. I'll talk for a little bit about the brush tools that are inside Blender and some of the settings I use. There's kind of a lot to it. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but first of all, there's a lot of stuff I wish I knew before I started all this. First of all, you might not even know how this works, but the MeshDraw is a Bezier curve to begin with. And so if you have a Bezier curve, even though it's made of all these smaller sub-splines, you can take it into edit mode, and then that gives you access to all these tools here. And the two that we're going to, all of them work, but the two that we're concerned with now is draw and the curve pen. And for me, draw is kind of the biggest one. I tend to try to just kind of slop it in there and then correct it later. There's a ton of options with this stuff though. So the most obvious one is this up here, where you can choose to align to the cursor or a surface. And right now my cursor is at the origin. And so what that means is basically there's a plane, an invisible plane from my view at the depth of that cursor. And if I draw something, it's going to be parallel to my camera, or perpendicular to my camera, I guess, and at the depth of that cursor. Even if it's way over here, that's still what it's doing. And surface, on the other hand, is for, you'd use that obviously for trying to draw on a surface. But there's some settings in here that I use quite a bit. One of which is this one right here, which is called only first. And you'll find if you have surface and you're just using it willy-nilly, you're going to get some crazy curves that are snapping everywhere and out of control. But so oftentimes if you use only first, and we try that again, it's only stealing the depth from that first and then going from there. And then how it goes, this is also very confusing, but is plain, normal, and view. I usually set it to view. Again, that works just like how it was with cursor. So there's an imaginary plane that's parallel to my view. I'm going to click here. It's going to set the depth, and then it's going to draw it parallel to what my camera was looking at. So that's all I'm going to go into those. Obviously, the Blender documentation will cover all that stuff in way more detail, but stuff's not that intuitive. So there's that. There's also some commands up here that I couldn't live without. In fact, I used them constantly. I mapped keyboard shortcuts to them. And let's draw some bad curve. Well, we have this one already. Let's draw some more like bad curves. There we go. So something like that obviously doesn't look good. But if you come up here to control points, there's smooth, which will kind of average out the points, which helps quite a bit. And then there's also recalculate handles. So this takes all these janky handles and kind of realigns them. And I mentioned I have these mapped actually to my numpad. So even a super messed up curve like this, I can just kind of smooth it, realign the handles, and I can kind of get it back to something that, well, it's kind of just straight now, but you get the idea. Another incredibly useful thing is when you're trying to select these things, because you can see it can be a total mess. You may want to like turn on a X-ray mode if you're having trouble selecting them. But if you can get even one point on the thing, then you can come up here to select linked, and then that'll grab the whole thing. And so I'm also doing that. There's also a shortcut for that. And so if I wanted to, pull out just that one messed up one, and then again, smooth, recalculate handles, and then we're looking pretty good. And also, I think you can like duplicate as well, which is pretty cool. So yeah, there's that. And is that it? Okay, I think there's one more important one, which is radius minimax. So this depends if you're scaling by length. This is maybe less of a important thing, but this can really come in handy. If I'm doing something and I want them all to come out, like I want to do some small ones and some big ones, you can come in here and you can say radius max is 0.5, or I guess you could set them with the same. And so they're all going to be that size, and then do something large, and then they're all going to be that size. And you can use pen pressure, but that doesn't work. That doesn't work well at all. So okay, I think that's maybe everything. Oh, if I haven't already done it, the per point stuff. If you don't know, the way that you adjust these things is in the item tab, and you'll see it's context sensitive. So if I don't have any vertices or any control points selected, nothing shows up there. But if I grab at least one control point, then we get this radius and tilt, which I'm calling tilt twist. I'm kind of using those interchangeably. So again, with that select linked, I can grab a single point on one of these, select link, and then I can adjust the radius. Or you can grab a big chunk of these and adjust the radius, adjust the twist. So that's very, very cool. Also, these tools down here work, so you can do proportional adjustments of these. I like to do connected only, and so if I can grab just the end, and then I can like scale this up with the fall off. See, so it's it's like any other editing, but you may not know that it works on curves as well. Right, that's everything you ever wanted to know about curves tools in Blender. Now I'm going to talk about libraries and how they relate. So I basically use this thing exclusively with the library. It's very convenient because essentially you need to import it over and over again to use it. So it's nice to have a way to do that. As with everything in Blender, it actually is does get a little complicated in some aspects. So do my best to explain this. Show you how that works. So what I just pulled up is my user library. And if you don't know what that is, essentially in the preferences and the file paths, you can tell it where your user library is. It's going to check that folder every time Blender starts. And if we come out here and look, you can see I've got an asset for the MeshDraw itself. When I release this thing, it'll probably be named without the number. This alpha thing, that's something totally different. And then there's, this is where all my brushes are packed into as assets into the single file with all the textures and everything packed all in there. So it's just one package. And that's in that folder defined in the preferences. So if you do that, and you pull up your user library, you'll see something kind of like this. And so this allows you to just quickly drag in MeshDraw and all the different brush packs. So the settings are very important here. There's 3 different ways that you can bring something in. Now, it kind of actually works no matter which one you pick, although I would recommend append for the MeshDraw. And so I can pull that in. I don't like that you, as far as I know, you have to drag it into your scene and then it puts it, God knows where. That totally sucks. But you can immediately come in here and say clear location or rotation or scale. Of course, there's a keyboard shortcut with that. So first thing I always do is I pull it in, I clear it, and then I'm good to go. And so for the MeshDraw tool itself, I always use append. The reason I use append instead of the default, which is append reuse data, is that if you have more than one of them in your scene, they would be sharing the data if you reuse data, and so that's a problem. You can fix it, but it just gets messy. For the brushes themselves, it's going to, I usually leave it on append reuse data, or sometimes link. And if I just pull one of these brush sets in here, it works, but I will point out, let's see. Okay. As I've mentioned multiple times, the most important thing is that the brush is ranging between 0 to, meshes are ranging between 0 to 1 in the brush collection. So that actually doesn't look terrible. You can't have this all. Maybe it doesn't matter. Okay, maybe I'm a liar. I always reset the brush collection too. It's a good habit to get into, I think. And the cool thing too is that you can turn it off. You can not render it. You can turn it off. It works just fine that way. You will notice the way that I have these packaged up though is that you only see the collection. Can't see anything inside the collection. So that's this one. And also you see I have these numbers here. We'll get into that later. Well, let me just finish Okay, link. So what this does with append reuse data, it is actually pulling in all the like the mesh data and the texture. Well, in this with the embedded textures, yes, it's pulling all that stuff in, embedding it in your scene. If you draw multiple, it's reusing. It's not duplicating that data every time you draw a stroke. That would be a nightmare. But yeah, so that's what that's doing. Link also works, and let's pull another one of these in. Again, I pull it in, I immediately reset it back. And we can switch out to that. You can see also in here, there's a little L link, I guess link file maybe, I don't know. I have a few issues with link Blender. It's not related to this tool, it's just it works great and it keeps your file sizes really small. It can become a complete nightmare if anything changes and you have to relink it later on. It's just absolute train wreck. However, as I mentioned, you can't see. So this one was linked, and you can see the little chain. It tells it that it's linked. What if I actually want all these models here? Maybe I want to, take some of them out, rearrange them, do whatever. The only one that will let you do that is actually link. So the way that works is select the library, which is selected. And then you have to come down here to Object Relations, Make Library Override. Now you can see the parts, but everything is still linked. And you can't like adjust anything on these things. But then you can select all that and you can come down here, relations, and then say make local all. That's going to do meshes, textures, everything. Then once I've done that, this is now like fully in this file, and I can edit these things. I can do whatever I want, and I think there's some crazy stuff that goes on because I had already linked to it before I converted it. There's probably 2 of them in there now. Yeah. Let's see. So if I say delete that, yeah. So I don't know. Honestly, it's still, I've been working with this for months now and I'm still confused by it. It still has that F, so I don't know what that stands for, but we've got multiple copies and it's just kind of a messy thing. But okay, so that's all I'm going to say about libraries. Use append for the MeshDraw tool itself. Generally, append reuse for these. With everything, you pull it in, you clear the transformations, and then the tile brushes. So we're gonna have another section on this. But for tile brushes, you actually have to pull them in as linked, and you have to clear this stuff out if you want to be able to adjust the individual controls, because they're not just simple meshes. They're complicated collections in their own right. So we'll talk about that later. This is using modifiers and geometry nodes along with the MeshDraw. And so the main thing I'm going to show is like tiling meshes. And I want to show with these brush sets that I'm including, the MD tiled is the one where I'm doing all this stuff. And we have to import this a special way because we need access to like the controls on these more complicated things. So in order to get to all that stuff, I need to actually bring it in as a link. Clear the transformations. And it comes in like that. And we need access to all the parts of it. So I need to, with it selected, I need to come in here, object, and relations, do a library override. I can get rid of this for now. So they're in here, but they're all still linked, and you can't like control any of the parts. So I then need to grab all of this stuff, object, relations, local, all. Now everything's in here, all the controls are in here. It's as if it was built in this file. And I think it's just for now, let me just kind of shake him. Most of these, we'll just work with this vine. Okay. So this is a vine tile that I made. And we can, if we look at this, you can see that it has modifiers. And it's an array. And also simple deform, set to stretch. Now I did some, what do they call these? Not expression, driven drivers? Yeah, drivers. Made some drivers. So the important thing to note here is that, remember, the most important thing, all these meshes must range between 0 to -1 on the y-axis. So even though I'm adding repetitions, it's shrinking it down with that stretch modifier so that it always fits. And that's very important. So yeah, let's use this thing. Of course, I have no idea which one it is. Probably that one. Looks about right. So this is with these tiling meshes, it's definitely a situation where you probably don't want to scale overall, or I mean scale by length rather, because it's just going to get the fat repetition thing coming up the whole way. So yeah, so we'll make some short ones and some really long ones. And yeah, so I mean, the thing here is that I'm modifying the mesh before it gets into the MeshDraw. So that means that, you know, it's going to apply the same repetitions to all the different models. And, you know, it works pretty good. You may find that you, so like you can like bake these things out. I'm gonna have a whole section on how to convert them properly. But for now, I'll just show you, you know, say I was happy with it like that. I can just go in here and convert it to mesh. And then that's just a mesh now. I probably shouldn't have made so many of these. And if I come up here now and I adjust the repetitions, you know, the other one's already baked. So that's kind of how you can work around that. I'm not going to go into, there's like so much you can do here. There's more. I have the flail from the introduction video where it repeats the chain but keeps the ends. I mean, that's basically doing the same thing as this. It's just a little more complicated. It's using geometry nodes instead of modifiers. But what I will show you is not using modifiers to change the mesh that you're drawing, rather to generate curves. So here's what that would look like. That, those. So I've prepared this ahead of time. It's a very simple geometry node network. So let's have a peek at that. The actual geometry node network isn't important, but I just want to show a couple of things, which is basically I'm generating a line of curves, and then you can distort them a little bit. And all that stuff's happening here. But what I want to point out is that you do need to take the original curve geometry and you need to join back into that. Otherwise it won't work. Like if I try to just plug it directly in, it's not going to work. The thing I really want to show is how do you change which object in the collection. In this collection, shoot, there's 4 models in this collection: tentacle, snake, an alligator, and a spider. So the way this is done, and this is, I'm not going to get into all the hacky technical details of it, but the way that I'm controlling which mesh gets picked on which spline is using an attribute called the curve spline resolution. And you change it with the node that's called set spline resolution. Now, that's not what that thing is meant for. This is a total bodge. I'm just like, using this thing that's totally unrelated to try to make it work for my tool. And part of that is that I'm using kind of some arbitrary seeming values. But the important thing you need to know if you're trying to do this yourself is that it's called set spline resolution, and the value starts at 20. Anything you add on top of 20 is going to change that index. So yeah, there we go. And it just modulates, so it just keeps going. But yeah, so starting at 20 and then add on integer values to choose which one. And so, yeah, you can do something like take the ID, for example, and then each, it's going to go in a successive each one. I should point out, the index, they're basically alphabetical in how they are in the collection. So you know what? Why not? Let's just show you this thing. Oh, weird. I just want to show you real quick. You can see here, you can see the numbers, and you can see, so I actually name them the order that I want them to be in: 0, 1, 2, 3. And I also, you may notice the thumbnail here, it is kind of hard to see, but I put those numbers on the thumbnail to make it easier so I can remember while I'm actually using it. So that's how you can control what order they go in, and using set spline resolution is how you can control from geometry nodes which spline gets which mesh. is how to convert from a MeshDraw object back into a standard mesh. So when you're done having fun with your MeshDraw thing, and it's time to actually make it into a real mesh, or if you want to export it out to a different package, all these kinds of things, here's how you go about doing it. So I've got this here, multiple different brushes, everything set up. Just go into object mode. MeshDraw is based on a Bezier curve, so if you can't just apply this. If you try to apply it, it says, hey, this thing's not a mesh. So what you do is you just convert it. Go to object, convert to mesh. And that's it, you're done. Well, unfortunately not quite yet. So it looks good, but refer to the section earlier. I said I was talking about UV considerations. There's a bunch of workarounds that we're doing with UVs here to get it to work. And so while this is a mesh and it does look okay, it's still actually using the UVs that I copied over inside the MeshDraw. So if you go down here to attributes, you see there's this MDUV. Just so happens that the shader that I made uses MDUVs as well as the regular UVs. So you couldn't export this out to some other program. So what we need to do is actually create real UVs and copy the information onto those UVs. So you'll notice that there is no UV map. It started as a Bezier curve, so that makes sense that it wouldn't have a UV map. But if we add one, you'll immediately notice that it's not looking so good. And so I made this script, and we're going to talk about the MeshDraw panel a little bit later, but it has this button down here that will copy the UVs. So all it's doing is it's taking this attribute, the MDUVs, and copying those vertex for vertex over to the actual UVs. And I'll hit this button and you will see something. Oh, first I selected the mesh, by the way, and you can do multiple at the same time if you want to. So I hit the button and it takes a minute, and then it eventually finishes. Now, something changed, but it still isn't looking good. Now, it actually worked, and it actually is fine, and you could actually export this to a different program, just like this. But the reason it looks so messed up, if you refer back to the section about the UV considerations, I talked about sort of this hacky thing that I'm doing where I'm adding together the MDUVs and the regular UVs. And it worked because one of them was always blank while the other one wasn't. But in this case, now they're both valid. So in this case, the MDUVs are working against us. We can, well, first of all, we could just get rid of, ooh, that doesn't look good. We can get rid of the MDUVs. It's still looking a little weird. But what we probably would rather do is get rid of that attribute. It's no longer being used. It's just taking up space and it's not doing anything. So if we just kill that attribute, and okay, so yeah, I killed the MDUV attribute. These other attributes, I don't even know what that is, but this is now perfectly fine. It's also worth pointing out that all these things have different materials, but it still works. The material ID per face is being retained, which is really cool. And that is that. You have to use this script, and the script will be the topic of the next video. Time to get into the MeshDraw panel, and kind of I want to point out that it's optional. You can definitely use the tool without the panel, but what you'll find is that it lacks a lot of functionality. So if you want to be able to quickly change per stroke which mesh is being selected, you've pretty much got to use this panel. It is very hacky. I will be the first to admit that. I'm not super proud of this. I'm definitely trying to force a square peg through a round hole with this whole thing, but it does work, and so we'll go into that. I should point out, if you're generating curves that are going into the going directly, if you're generating curves instead of drawing them and using geometry nodes, then you'd have no need for this. If you don't need to change which shape per thing, then you don't need this. It's really more for quick drawing on the fly. And so let me show you how this works. I've got my brush all set up that you just saw with the animals, and so if I just draw something out, it's just going to draw index 0. Showing those? Cool. Okay. So it's going to draw index 0. And there's no way to change that. It's because I'm using this hacky curve resolution thing to store which mesh I want the instancer to use. So in order to change that, you've got to use this panel. So the indexes correspond to how they are laid out in the collection. And for all the brushes I made, I numbered them so it would be easy to see. I also, in the thumbnails, I put the numbers on them. So Tentacle is index 0. So anything I draw out is just going to be the tentacle. There's no way for me to change that, really. They're not an easy way. But if you change your current index, say to 1, which corresponds to the snake, as long as I have one control point selected, or even just a handle, and I hit change selected, it will change that. So these down here, these are like, that's the actual brush. And so we can change multiple curves at a time, and that works pretty good. But what if you want to change them faster? Well, that's where this thing comes in, and this is where it really gets hacky. What this is doing, I'm calling it the Watcher, which I know sounds kind of ominous, but it kind of is ominous. It's sort of watching what you're doing, and it's trying to figure out if you're drawing strokes, and if you are, it changes the last stroke. You'll notice after every stroke that I draw, the whole stroke is selected. So I'm taking advantage of that. And if this thing's watching and it thinks you're drawing strokes, it will change whatever the last selected thing is, which happens to be your last stroke. And yeah, so let's just dive into that. I click this button, toggle watcher, and now it says it's watching. You'll also may notice that it's showing you what it's watching, and it's even like counting the number of splines. And the current index is set to 3 here, so which corresponds to alligator. So as long as all this stuff is not mistaken, then the next stroke I draw should be a number 3, and there it is. And so if I change that to, I can draw spiders, and you get the idea. 4, it looped back around to the beginning. That's just how Blender does these indexes. 3 is my highest index. They start at 0. Okay, so that's cool. But even that is kind of too slow. So what I've done is included a function that you can map keyboard shortcut to. And you can do this, you can set this up however you want. In my case, I set it up in the global 3D view, and I set it to my numpad. So, you know, if you really wanted to go fast with this thing, you might want to consider something like this. So I chose the numpad. You can do anything you want. The command that you're looking for is this right here, mesh_draw.md change index, and then you give it the index. So I just mapped 0 to 0, 1 to 1, 2 to 2, so on and so forth. And when I press the button on my keyboard now, you'll see even down here, info that it's showing you that it's changed, and you'll also see it right here. Oh, it's because I'm okay. So yeah, so you can see that's how you're able to do stuff quickly, is to map a keyboard shortcut to that command and do this like that. So that works. What the hell is a watcher, and what does it mean to be watching it? Well, in Python terms, it's installing something called an app handler. That's kind of basically aggressively, it's calling some Python code every time you do pretty much anything. Yeah, so it's not the greatest solution. It works. The reason I made it a toggle is you can turn it off. I'm sure, you know, I tend to forget that and leave it on, but it's okay. It won't stay persistent between sessions. That's important to point out. And this is definitely something, if there's, you know, technical users out there, Python people, I'm, you know, way open to suggestions for better, cleaner ways to do this. I'm not happy with this. I'm not proud of it. But it was what I was able to get working. And so I'm sticking with it. So that is the MeshDraw panel, which also includes the UV copying, which I covered in the other section about converting meshes. So that is that. Mesh is stretching between different curves. My guess is this will be a very common one. You might not notice it. If you only have one curve, it might look okay. I should probably point out that here's the actual curve I'm drawing. This is the brush that I imported. But as soon as I start ending up with multiple strokes, we start getting this sort of thing going on, where one mesh is stretching across and connecting to the other. That happens because the mesh being used for the brush is not fitting within the 0 to -1 range on the y-axis. And you can see that this isn't. So all you got to do is shrink it a little bit, and still a little bit off. You technically want it ideally to be leave a little bit of padding on either side. You prefer it not to go all the way to the ends, but if you're getting stretching between curves, then check to make sure that the brush that you're using is fitting between the -0 to -1 range. Is twisting around all crazy looking. Kind of like, of course, it won't do it when I want it to. Almost. Something like, okay, there we go. Your mesh is twisting around all crazy like this. So there's a section on this called what is the UpHint UpHint, I think I called it. It's sort of a shortcoming of the tool. It's not too difficult to work around. Basically, there's only so much range that this thing can handle, and it'll flip around 180 if it goes beyond that range. What you want to do is you want to provide it a vector that tells it what should be up, and that vector should be ideally perpendicular to the direction of travel of the curve. So in this case, I'm trying to make vertical things, but my up vector is also vertical, so that's going to cause this twisting to happen. And so I could remedy that by changing to a different angle. You also, depending how bad it is, there's quite a bit of leeway with this. You know, most of the time you can kind of just like tweak it a little bit, and I'm making it worse now. This is sort of an extreme case. Usually you can kind of smooth them out and get them to work anyway. And if you need something more complicated, such as drawing it all on all different angles along a surface, then you use an up object. Again, the section to check into more detail is called, what did I call it? What is this up? What is the UpHint all about? So check that out. How do I change? How do I change the mesh that this is drawing? This brush has brush set has 4 different meshes in it, and every time I draw, I'm only getting the first one. Well, the short answer is you kind of can't with it right out the box. If you're generating curves from geometry nodes, you can change them, and other than that, if you want to be able to change these things easily on the fly, you have to use the MeshDraw Panel script. You have to install that, or at least run it in your script editor. And I have a section on that. It's called the MeshDraw Panel. Please refer to that section for more details. But the short answer is, once that script is installed, there's a couple of different options. Where to go? Finally. Sorry about that. When you have the MeshDraw Panel installed, it shows up on the item section in the 3D view while you're editing. And so you can change the current index. You select at least one point on the curve that you want to change, and you can change the index like that. This is only going to change the thing that you made. So as soon as I draw another one, it's going right back to 0. So if you want to be able to change them on the fly, and if you want to map keyboard shortcuts to it, you'll use this thing called the Watcher. So I explain it in more detail in the section titled the MeshDraw Panel. When this thing's enabled, now all of a sudden I can change this, and I've mapped keyboard shortcuts to each of these. That's how you can change the index on the fly. UVs have disappeared. So there's 2 sections of this video to look into. One is called the UV considerations, and the other is called converting to mesh, I think. Converting to a standard mesh. So here, this is the brush I'm going to use. This is in this collection, and that's the mesh that I want to use. I have this mesh draw here, and as soon as I assign it and I come in here and add that collection, notice that there is still some texture, or it's the right color, but clearly the UVs are messed up here. This is, as I go in more detail in those other sections, there's kind of a workaround that we're doing here, where I'm copying UV information over to make it work with the MeshDraw. And when I do that, I'm explicitly calling out the UV map by name. And what I'm using is Blender's default UV map name, which is UV map. If your UV map for the mesh that you want to warp is not named UV map, then it will not copy over and you'll end up with something like this. So all you have to do is name that default thing, and then the texture should come back. So that's one instance where the UVs might be missing. But there's more, which is after you convert it, there's going to be another UV issue that comes up. So for that case, it's important to point out that the MeshDraw is a Bezier curve to start out with. So when it converts, it doesn't know that it needs UVs. And let's do that. Let's convert this object over. And it looks good, but that's just because of my crazy shader that I have on there. If you didn't have that shader on, it would again look like that. So the problem is that you don't have any UVs. When it made the conversion, there's now no longer any UVs there. So what you want to do is add some UVs, and it's just the default thing, so it's all screwed up. But then you can use the MeshDraw panel as a button here. So if you just select the objects that you want to convert, worth pointing out, the MeshDraw UVs are stored in an attribute that stays after you convert it. And all this script is doing is just copying from that MeshDraw UV into the UV. So we just hit that button. Now we're back to normal. So regular mesh, the regular UV map, ready to export to any other program. Once you've done that, you don't need these MD UVs anymore, so you might as well get rid of them. And that one too, I don't even know where that's coming from. It's not helping. I guess I should point out one last thing on the copying the UVs. It is a Python script. It's been working pretty good for me, but if it's not working, you might want to come up and toggle the system console and see there's some info. I print some info there, and if there's an error, you might see something in there as well. That is how to fix the UV problems with MeshDraw. The undo bug. So unfortunately, there's a bug here that I have not found a workaround for yet, or at least nothing clean. If you are using the MeshDraw panel and you are using the watcher, so it's automatically changing your strokes, you'll notice that if you keep drawing these out, and this is index 1 that I'm drawing, if I hit Control-Z to undo, it undid the stroke that I was trying to get rid of, which is great. But you'll notice it also set the previous stroke back. And I think what it's doing is it's basically replaying that last stroke, and then my watcher script thing is not catching it. So I don't have a solution to this. I will say it does select it, and if you're on the index that you want to be on, you can just click the button. So it's not terrible. And also the other thing you can do is if you draw a stroke that you don't like, you can just immediately hit the delete key, just delete the segments. Then that way you're not causing an undo. And yeah, that only applies when you're using the script and when you're like in the middle of drawing. If you come in here and start doing a bunch of other stuff and then undo, you'll be fine. So that is the undo bug. Currently no solution, but that's